Tonight, the 25th day of the Hebrew month of Tishrei, is the yartzheit, the day of the passing of the holy tzaddik, defender and advocate for every Israeli, every Jew, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. And so in his honor, I'd like to share a story. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak had a certain student, a chassid, named Yosel. And Yosel was a melamed, he was a teacher, and back in those days sometimes it was incredibly hard to make ends meet. Unfortunately, he saw no alternative. He wasn't making any money where he lived, and therefore he had to go abroad for a long period of time in order to hopefully raise some funds that he could then come home and provide for his family with. He was gone for about 12 years, but thankfully after those 12 years he had accumulated 900 ruble, back in those days quite a large sum of money, and he was on his way back home. But he figured, before I head home, maybe I'll stop by my Rebbe. And so that's what he did. He went by Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, and he was able to get a blessing from the Rebbe. But the Rebbe, as he was about to leave the door, the Rebbe stopped him and he says, "Hey, don't you want some advice before you head out?" So the chassid said, "Of course, I'd love some advice." So he says, "Well, the thing is that this advice comes at a cost." So he says, "Okay." He says, "Well, the first piece of advice costs about 300 ruble. Chassid thinks to himself, "Wow, that took me about 4 years to make that amount of money, but surely if it's coming from my Rebbe, the holy tzaddik, it must be good." So he pays the 300 ruble. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak says to him, "When you're asked, say right." Chassid's like, "What kind of advice is this?" But okay. So he turns and he's about to leave, and the Rebbe says, "Wait, I have another piece. Do you want another piece of advice?" The chassid, he's a bit flabbergasted, but he says, "Yes, I do." He says, "Well, this one also costs 300 ruble. Chassid thinks to himself, "Wow, that's I don't know." But then he says, "No, what am I thinking? Of course." He hands over the 300 ruble, and Rabbi Levi Yitzchak says, "When you see an old man and a young one, danger, beware." Chassid says, "Again, this is such strange advice, but you know what? If it's from my Rebbe, it has to be holy, it has to be good." He says, "Thank you, Rebbe." And again, he turns to bid farewell to head out the door. And finally, the Rebbe stops him again and he says, "I have one last piece of advice for you, but it's going to cost you 300 ruble. Yosel is holding on to his last 300 pieces of ruble, and a bit broken-hearted, he hands it over. And he says, "Yes, Rebbe, what's your advice?" And the Rebbe says, "Do not believe what you don't see with your own eyes." He's completely confused, but with that, he says, "Thank you, Rebbe," and he turns and he leaves. He's a bit downtrodden. All the money that he had made over 12 years of labor is now gone. But he has faith and trust in his Rebbe that he would never lead him astray. And so with that, he has a silent confidence as he starts trotting on his way home. Suddenly, as he's going on his way along the main road, a wagon comes by and making a great deal of noise. "Quick, where is them? Where are they? Where are they?" And suddenly the first thing that pops in the chassid's mind is, when asked, say right. So he says, "To the right." So they say, "Thank you, bye," and they all head off. A few hours later, they come back along the road, this wagon, and they say, "Sir, thank you. You're the one that helped us catch those bandits, those robbers. So you have earned your share of the reward." And they hand him 600 ruble. Can't believe it. He's so excited. Okay, you know what? Some consolation. Thank you. Says goodbye to them, and off he goes on his way. As the night is coming along, the sun is setting, he comes to a certain inn and he knocks on the door, and an old man answers and he says, "Hi, it's getting dark. Do you mind if I get a room for the night, please?" The old man looks a bit lit out of sorts, and he says, "Of course." But then suddenly a very young woman pops out and she says, "No, sorry, there's no rooms available. Get out of here." So the Chassid Yossel is a bit thrown off, and he turns, and as he's heading out of the door, he thinks to himself about the second piece of advice. When you see an old man and a young one, beware danger. So he decides, you know what, I'm going to stick around. He goes and he hides behind a bush and he watches. A few hours go by, and suddenly a bunch of menacing looking men show up, and they slowly creep over to the house, and the woman goes to the door and opens the door. Immediately, Yossel screams at the top of his lungs, "Beware! Danger! Beware! Danger! Beware! Danger!" The neighbors wake up, everyone wakes up. Suddenly the cops come by, and they find that indeed there was a plot to kill the old man, but because of Yossel, he was saved. The old man was so thankful that he gave a reward of 300 ruble to Yossel. Now Yossel has made up the 900 ruble he had given for the 3 pieces of advice. He leaves and he is so ecstatic. Now he's finally coming home. And as he comes into town, no one really recognizes him. He's been gone 12 years. And he goes over to someone and he says, "Hey, do you remember a certain Melamed that used to live here?" And they said, "Yeah, actually, I think I do." He says, "Do you know anything about his family, his wife?" "Oh, it's a sad story, sir." "What do you mean it's a sad story?" They said, "Unfortunately, it seems that the wife has been mixing with the wrong kinds of people, and I don't know, it's not good." Yossel is a bit downcast, but then he thinks to himself, final piece of advice. The Rebbe said, "Don't believe anything you don't see with your own eyes." So he says, I need to stand firm. He decides to go to his home, and again, he sits a short distance away behind a bush, and he watches. Nightfall comes, and as it does, he notices a young man come to the door, knock on the door. His wife opens and is very excited to see him, kisses him on the cheek, and brings him in. And Yossel says, "Oi, well now I've seen it with my own eyes. Oi, oi, oi." He says, "You know what? Let's not jump to conclusions. Let's be patient." He stays there, and he's dozing off. Hours have gone by. He's falling asleep. Suddenly, even before dawn, the young man opens the door, says goodbye to his wife, and he leaves. Yossel says, "Well, that's it." He goes over a short while afterwards, knocks on the door. His wife immediately sees him, recognizes him. She's so excited. "You're home, you're home. Everyone, Abba's home. Daddy's home." All the kids come running. "Oh my gosh, it's been so long." He barely recognizes his kids. Finally, after giving them all a hug and a kiss, eating a meal, turns to his wife and he says, how could you?" And she says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, I was actually here overnight, and I saw that young man show up, and he left before dawn." And she says, "Oh, you probably don't recognize him." She says, "Well, you were gone for so long, and how else was I going to provide for the family?" So our eldest son, Yankel, he didn't have a really good Jewish background and everything, but he found a job at the nobleman's home, and he's there all day long, but yet he stays firm to his belief in Judaism, and he won't eat there. And so each night he sneaks out and he comes, and I make him a meal of kosher food, and he eats a meal of kosher food, and he stays here all night studying Torah so he can remain connected. Suddenly, Yossel is so relieved, and he's so thankful, and he realizes, were it not for his faith in his Rebbe, that his Rebbe wouldn't lead him astray, and he didn't give him the 900 ruble for those 3 pieces of advice, he would have just come home, and he would have jumped to conclusions, and he would have been devastated, and who knows what could have been. But thankfully, he put his confidence and his trust in his Rebbe, and in the end, the Rebbe, like always, had his best interests at heart, saw what he needed, and gave him what he needed. And we merit to connect to all the tzaddikim, but specifically on this special day of 25th of Tishrei, to Rabbi Liady Yitzchak of Berditchev, the defender of Israel.